The
It
tax
is
on you.
it's part of that, I'm sure. But and lawyers are concerned about that, even though we haven't consolidated lawyers. They're telling me about talking, because what the government is doing is making a political attack, and they are organizing around this legal narrative, so that anything I say, not anything I say now, anything I've said over the last several years, anything of the texts and emails and videos and things like that they have from me is something that they would use to create a narrative that would support these charges, these bogus charges that they. So that's real serious. I mean, and it places me in a very precarious kind of situation. The question I'm confronted with is whether I shut up and not say anything about it, not fight back, not respond to it. And because if I do that, then it's like having been assassinated or having been imprisoned because I assassinated and imprisoned myself. So the right to be able to talk about Black people and the oppression of my people has been taken away from me because I've agreed to cooperate to that level. So it's a very tenuous kind of situation. And for me, a fundamental question is all these people who proclaim a belief in First Amendment rights, belief in civil rights, etc., and especially lawyers. We need you. Because what is happening now is what they were able to successfully do at certain times in the history of the struggle in this country. They want to deny us the right to access to a full democratic process here. So they would drive people on the ground and force people into precipitous actions like armed struggles and stuff like that. I'm telling that we need people to step forward. We need lawyers. And we don't have a lot of money. Our money goes to these programs that we created for our community. We need people to make contributions. We need people to provide legal assistance here so that we can wage this struggle. Because it ain't my struggle. It really isn't. It's for everybody who proclaim to believe in what this country says it's supposed to be about. And it seems to me that's where a lot of the responsibility is.
Yeah. That is Omali Yeshitela from the African People's Socialist Party, talking about his persecution at the hands of the United States government. Let's give you some background. 4 Americans affiliated with a Black empowerment and political organization have been charged, along with 3 Russians, with conspiring to covertly sow discord in U.S. society, spread Russian propaganda, and interfere illegally in American elections, according to an indictment that was unsealed. The U.S. citizens and 2 Russians were added to an existing case in Tampa, Florida, federal court involving Alexander Ionov, described by prosecutors as the founder of a Moscow-based organization funded by the Russian government to carry out clandestine influence campaigns in the United States. The 4 Americans are all part of the African People's Socialist Party and Uhuru movements, which has locations in St. Petersburg, Florida, and St. Louis. Among those charged is Omali Yeshitela, chairman of the U.S.-based organization, which was raided by FBI last summer when Ionov was originally charged. Yeshitela and 3 other citizens, Penny Joanne Hess, Jesse Neville, and Augustus C. Romaine Jr., are charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States. Hess, Yeshitela, and Neville are also charged with impersonating agents of a foreign government. Ionov and the other 2 Russians who remain in their country face fraud conspiracy charges. Court records did not list attorneys for any of the 7 defendants, and it wasn't immediately clear if they have been arrested. An email seeking comment was sent to the African People's Socialist Party, which have previously denied working covertly for Russia or that any members committed a crime. Now, the prosecution states that Ionov operated an entity called the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia that was used to carry out U.S. influence efforts overseen by Russian intelligence. The service was known as the FSB. They recruited American-based organizations to help sway elections, make it appear that there was strong support in the U.S. for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and backing efforts such as the 2015 United Nations position to decry the genocide of African people in the U.S., according to the indictment. Among other things, the indictment charges that an unnamed candidate for local office in St. Petersburg received clandestine, St. Petersburg, Florida. Let's be clear about that. Received clandestine funding and political strategy from the group. Ionov and another Russian said that at one point that their Florida efforts would extend to the 2020 presidential campaign, which they called the main topic of the year. The Uhuru group did have a candidate who ran unsuccessfully for St. Petersburg City Council in 2019, Aretha Akili Kanan, who is not charged in the indictment. Now, she held a press conference last year. I actually played, I believe, some of it when I covered this case last summer when they first were raided. I talked about this. You can look through the archives at my YouTube page, Scott Cannon WLTH. When I covered this in August of 2022. I just looked at the video the other day, so it's still up there. I believe I played some of her press conference saying that world colonial powers have been collaborating against Russia for more than a century, which is true. Now, the St. Petersburg, Florida mayor, Ken Welch, who is a Democrat, called these allegations troubling. I'm sorry for that noise. Somebody's drilling for some reason behind me. Somebody's drilling behind me. So it is important to underscore that the city of St. Petersburg does not support, condone, or tolerate any foreign government engaging in activities to undermine or influence our elections. Yeshitela, the man you just heard speaking, the indictment added, traveled from Tampa to Moscow in 2015 to meet with Ionov and other Russians to communicate on future cooperation. According to an Ionov email, what followed was covert Russian funding and support for various activities in the U.S. until the summer of 2022, including demonstrations at the California and Georgia state capitals at an unnamed social media company in San Francisco. Now, where have we heard this before? The idea that black revolutionaries, the idea that black radicals need Russians to tell us that we live in a racist society, that we are not smart enough on our own and not capable enough on our own to organize our own anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist agendas. We need some outsiders. We need some Russians. Where have we heard this before? I've talked on this show multiple times about a documentary that I watched a long time ago called Scandalize My Name, the stories from the Blacklist, about all these great black radical artists and entertainers who were blacklisted during the era of McCarthyism, during the 1940s and 1950s. And luckily, just luckily, I was able to finally track down this documentary. I found it online, and it's funny that this is happening now with the African People's Socialist Party, because this is exactly 70 years later what they did to people like Paul Robeson. It's important that we understand what they did to Paul Robeson. This is a clip from Scandalize My Name. This will illustrate the evil things that the United States government did to Paul Robeson and to other artists like him during the time period of McCarthyism.
Figures in American culture. It was one of the greatest figures in American culture. A singer, a giant of a man, an all-American football player, Phi Beta Kappa, law student, actor, Shakespearean, and a leader of his people.
And so inspiring was he and so powerful was he that at all costs, he had to be silenced. And as a matter of fact, on the agenda to silence him was the understanding that if we can silence him, all others will come far more easily.
Paul was a threat because he was a tremendously intelligent and well-learned man. Paul also had charisma in the same sense that Martin Luther King had charisma. In other words, Paul was the kind of man that could lead masses of people. And those who understand those things knew that Paul Robeson was the man who could affect large majorities. Now, all this took place in an atmosphere superheated by the relationships between Russia and America at the time.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States.
The reason that Robeson was a very strong supporter of the Soviet Union was it was his belief that they had no discrimination policies against blacks there or against anybody else. Well, he was treated like a prince whenever he came there. He didn't really know what was going on in the rest of the country. So his identification with the Soviet Union, whether he was an actual communist or not, was unimportant. He was theirs, and he supported them in policies both political and cultural, and made a big speech at one point that no black man and no black person in America would ever go to war against the Soviet Union, which sounded like he was calling for treason among the black population in the United States.
The state media made about blacks not fighting against their own interest was interpreted by a lot to mean that he was saying to us, you blacks can't fight. You shouldn't fight the Russians no matter what. Then the powers that be, meaning J. Edgar Hoover, had to cut down Paul's influence. And they set out to demolish the man, and they took some heavy bites out of him.
Baseball's top hitter and star second baseman of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, comes to bat for Uncle Sam to refute Paul Robeson's remark that U.S. Negroes would not fight in a war against Russia.
I'm on my way to Washington to testify before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. That's all I can say at this time. I'll make further statements from Washington.
Robinson is the last witness to testify concerning the loyalty of the members of his race. And before the committee, he reads his own prepared statement.
I've been asked to express my views on Paul Robeson's statement in Paris to the effect that American Negroes would refuse to fight in any war against Russia because we love Russia so much. I haven't any comment to make except that on that statement, except that if Mr. Robeson actually made it, it sounds very silly to me. And most Negroes and Italians and Irish and Jews and Swedes and Slavs and other Americans would act just as all these groups did in the last war. They'd do their best to keep their country out of war. If unsuccessful, they'd do their best to help their country win the war against Russia or any other enemy that threatened us.
Now see, right there, this is a tactic they've been using for a long time when it comes to denouncing anybody who's black, who's a part of the civil rights movement, who's a radical, who comes out against U.S. imperialism. And you see they got Jackie Robinson, who they propped up there to be the good Negro. They always got to have the good Negro to come and talk down on the bad Negro to say, no, 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 no. Don't be like this black. Be like the other black. So what Paul Robeson was saying is, look, America enslaved us for hundreds of years. At this point, Jim Crow was still alive and well raging. He was saying, look, there's no reason for black people to be fighting the Russians and mad at the Russians when the white people in America treat us like this. They got Jackie Robinson out there to say, oh, look at the good Negro, Jackie Robinson. He'll fight for America no matter how bad they treat black people. Now, this is a man, one of the greatest baseball players ever, one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, definitely, who could not even eat lunch and dinner in the same restaurants with his teammates. He had to eat on the bus. He had to stay in different hotels than his teammates in the 1940s. And they drag him out there to be some sort of defender of the American system and help tear down a great, great black man like Paul Robeson. You hear in the clip, you hear Ozzie Davis, you hear Harry Belafonte also talking about how they did Mr. Paul Robeson. It's unfortunate. Last week, we talked about Mr. Harry Belafonte with his passing. And again, it just coincidentally, all this started happening at the same exact time that he's passing. And Mr. Belafonte actually has a large segment in this documentary as well, where he talks about how he was considered a Russian stooge and a Russian puppet and blacklisted and put on a blacklist in the 1950s until Ed Sullivan rescued him from being kept off of American TV and movies.
When I first discovered the blacklist, was I had gone to see my agent, and it was about getting a job in television. And he was an agent in one of the most powerful agencies in America, and I was just at the threshold of the launching of my own career. And he pulled out a drawer in his desk, reached for a phone. It was not part of the regular phone bank. He dialed a number, and all he did was to give my name, Harry Belafonte. And then he waited for instruction. And then he hung up the phone, closed the drawer, and said, "You're on the list. You're unemployable."
We figured, we would go crazy if we tried to figure out whether we were blacklisted because we were black or blacklisted because we were red.
Evening old scores is what this was all about.
Tradition was that whoever won the Tony Awards in the theater was on the following Sunday after the awards were given to appear on the most popular television show in America, The Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan was rooted in American journalism. He was a most powerful reporter. And he and Walter Winchell and Dorothy Kilgallen and a host of journalists used their tabloids to become supporters of the blacklist. And when my name came up as the winner of the Tony Award, he was told that I was unacceptable. And he then called me to come and have an interview with him, and I went. And he said, there is some resistance to your coming on the show because of, and he read a list of things that I had been accused of. And I said to him that many of the things on the list were true, and other things on the list were false. But I do not choose to identify which is true and which is false, because that is not really the issue. The issue is my right to privacy, my right to my beliefs as an American citizen, and that I was sorry that I did not have the opportunity to appear on his show. I would dearly have loved to do so. It would have meant a lot to my career. And I thanked him and I left. That evening, I got a call from the very same agent who had picked up the phone in the other instance to tell me that I was on the Ed Sullivan Show and that I should be prepared to go to rehearsals that Saturday and that Sunday, and then I'd be on the air live that same weekend. This fact and this act forever took me off the blacklist. Just Ed Sullivan's endorsement alone gave me that relief. But what it did do was that it instantly raised significant suspicion among my colleagues that I had betrayed them, because there was no way for me to have gotten on the Ed Sullivan Show if I had not played the betrayal game. And it was a very, very, very difficult time for me.
Wow. Mr. Harry Belafonte, a man we just eulogized last week on this show, because this was a man whose career was deeply affected by being blacklisted because he fought against imperialism. He fought against the U.S. government's consistent desire to spread its tentacles around the world and use its military might to not only strangle people around the world, but strangle black people here. They sick the military on us many times in this country. And you see that he paid a very deep price. Even after he was taken off the blacklist, I did not know that Harry Belafonte was as big of a star as he was until I started reading about him, and I started to see, man, this dude he was the first black man to sell 1 million copies of a solo album. First black man to go platinum in America. He won a Tony Award. He accomplished all this stuff. Today, he would be the biggest star in America. And mostly, I knew him as a guy who was kind of famous for being a celebrity. I knew he had to hit the day, or I knew that, but I didn't know the extent of his star power. And a lot of that is because he spent his entire life, fighting against the military-industrial complex and fighting against the system of injustice that oppresses black people in this country, black people around the world. And they made him pay. They made him pay for many, many years. Now, another person who was made to pay very much with her career, and she did not recover at all, was Hazel Scott. Now, a lot of you may not know who Hazel Scott is. I know I certainly didn't for many years. So maybe it's just because I'm younger, but Hazel Scott actually was the first black person to have their own TV show in America. This woman in the 1940s had her own TV show. She was a singer. She was a pianist. She did all these great things. She was married to Adam Clayton Powell. Yes, that Adam Clayton Powell. One of the great voices of Black America during the Civil Rights Movement. And as a couple, they were targeted by J. Edgar Hoover, by the FBI, by the American government in general. And why is everybody choosing to, I'm sorry, everybody. People are choosing to do yard work, apparently, while I'm trying to talk here. But anyway, as a couple, they were forced to endure many years of harassment and degradation, and it ended up ending her career. This is the story of Hazel Scott during blacklisting and McCarthyism.
Throughout the 1940s, something which could be used against my mother and many others was the assertion that the causes that they embraced were also causes that the Communist Party embraced. When my mother was confronted with this, she said, I'm not going to relax my efforts to get equal rights for people of color merely because the Communist Party also embraces that effort. And she rejected as totally false any attempt to claim that she was a communist or communist sympathizer because of her work for civil rights. One of the criticisms of her was that she had entertained Soviet troops. I said, there you are, entertaining troops of our enemy. I remember a reporter asking her about this. Miss Scott, how could you have entertained these troops of our enemies? And she said, well, look at the date. It was 1943, and if you recall, we were their allies then. She did a great deal of entertaining of troops, and quite often you had joint forces then toward the end of the war. So she thought it was no small irony that she was accused of being unpatriotic for something which 5 years earlier had been the height of patriotism. And at the same time, she was married to a very controversial member of Congress who himself was the object of attacks by some of his colleagues and others. She was convinced that his enemies also had used her as a way to reach him, and that she was particularly vulnerable because of the fact that her livelihood depended on acceptance not only by the public, who were buying the tickets and turning on her radio show and television show, but also by the networks and the advertisers.
An atmosphere of mystery hung over the whole business of red channels. The copies disappeared into the desks of executives, and they began to use them to decide whether or not to hire an actor.
One of the themes of my mother's appearance before the Un-American Activities Committee was her repeated denials of the truth of what had been published. She said this is not true, and it was improper for a publisher to, in effect, try to end someone's career by publishing inaccurate information. My mother kept pointing out that at no time had anyone made a single telephone call to her, sent a telegram to her, sent a letter to her, asking, is any of this true?
The agency tried very hard not to put anything in writing about this whole system. And they even corrupted the language to take care of it. They didn't say he's not acceptable, they said he's not available.
In fact, her appearance before the committee was at her request. She hadn't been subpoenaed. Many people advised her not to do it. She said, this is a matter where not only my career, but my name have been taken and used improperly. Here you had someone who had had her own network radio program from the early 40s on. You had someone who was, I believe, the first black headliner of a weekly network television program, who appeared in movies regularly, and all of that stopped. And it all stopped just after the time of her appearance before the committee.
So we see right there, Miss Hazel Scott, the wife of Adam Clayton Powell, the first black person to have her own network show in this country. I actually did a counterpoint on Hazel Scott. I believe it's on my, I believe that's on my YouTube page too, Scott Cannon WLTH on YouTube. Just go to the counterpoint segments. I think they're all listed there in the playlist. I remember about 4 or 5 years ago doing a segment on Hazel Scott. And yeah, this, once again, you see this supremely talented black woman solely for speaking out against the injustice in this country and the hypocrisy of the American government, was called a Russian puppet, a communist, all this other stuff. And I love how they use that tactic that they always use, that she highlighted, that the American government will 1 minute tell you that somebody is our friend, and then the next minute tell you, we were never friends. What are you talking about? She said, a few years ago, us and Russia were friends. The Soviet Union were our allies in World War II. We were both fighting the Nazis. So when I was entertaining the troops in Moscow, I was entertaining an allies' troops. That never happened, apparently. Joseph Stalin was apparently never Time Magazine's Man of the Year. That none of this happened. We were never friends. Eleanor Roosevelt was never friends with, I forget what that very famous Russian sniper was. Her and Eleanor Roosevelt became very good friends and were until they died, but that never happened. We were never friends with the Soviet Union. Who said that? What? Huh? That's the trick they use now. They'll tell us 1 minute that Osama bin Laden is a warrior for peace. They literally said that. The New York Times in the 80s had a headline that said Osama bin Laden, warrior for peace. And then just a few years later, Osama bin Laden is our enemy and wants to kill all of us. These are the people who funded the Mujahideen when they were fighting the Russians in the 1970s and 80s. And now the Mujahideen are our enemies. And you gotta hate them. These are the people who will tell you, oh, Al-Qaeda did 9/11. We hate Al-Qaeda. We hate ISIS. We hate these people. And then they will help Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria when they're trying to occupy a third of Syria and take all of Syria's oil. Now, the reason they hate Donald Trump is because Donald Trump was honest. He said, yeah, we're taking the oil. He literally said that. We're taking the oil. Yeah, this oil is secure. That's what we're there for. We're taking the oil. It's ours now. That's what we're doing. That's why they hate Donald Trump. Not because he's racist. They're all racist. The people who treated Hazel Scott like that and Harry Belafonte like that and Paul Robeson like that, they were Democrats, they were Republicans, they were whoever was there helping to maintain the military-industrial complex. And the imperialist system and the system of Jim Crow that was there to kick black people in their behinds. That's what they're there for. Now, one thing that was not said about Jackie Robinson was what he said after he said what he said about Paul Robeson. Show you how sneaky they are. They only gave you a part in the mainstream media. They only gave you a part of Jackie Robinson's speech. But in the documentary, Morgan Freeman actually tells you what the rest of what Jackie Robinson had to say was.
When Jackie Robinson testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, he said something that was taken out of the newsreel. He said, the fact that it is a communist who denounces injustice in the courts, police brutality, and lynching doesn't change the truth of these charges. Just because communists kick up a big fuss over racial discrimination when it suits their purposes, a lot of people pretend that the whole issue is a creation of the communist imagination. And talk about communists stirring up Negroes to protest only makes the present situation worse than ever. Negroes were stirred up long before there was a Communist Party, and will stay stirred up long after the party has disappeared, unless Jim Crow has disappeared by then as well. Has it?
So even Jackie Robinson doing his job as the good Negro, the same role he actually played against Muhammad Ali back in the 1960s. They dragged Jackie Robinson out there to him and Joe Louis to be the voice against Muhammad Ali when he was fighting against the Vietnam War. But even then, Jackie Robinson had to admit, look, they got a point. They got a point. They're not just making stuff up. They do have a point, you know. And unless you actually do something to change the material well-being of black people in this country, then black people are going to keep sympathizing with all kinds of people whose ideologies and beliefs are closer aligned to our interest. That's not violence, that's intelligence, as Malcolm X would say. That's common sense. So the next time you see CNN and MSNBC and all these other, and Fox News and these other corporate media stations telling you about how everybody fighting against the imperialist war in Ukraine that we have right now, or who's fighting against American imperialism, the military-industrial complex is being propped up by Russia. Remember Harry Belafonte. Remember Paul Robeson. Remember Hazel Scott and Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee and all the things that they had to go through, being drugged through the mud for opposing the military-industrial complex. All right, folks, got to go to another break. Thank you for tuning in. This is Issues and Answers on WLTH 1370 AM. My Country with Scott Cannon. Give me a call, 219-885-1371. That number again, 219-885-1371. When we come back, happy happies!
A clean-up woman is a woman who...
I can't take this no more. I am tired. I know I'm lazy, but you know what? I need some help. I need somebody to help me do some cleaning around here.
Dr. J, have no fear. You can call me at Hunt and Christmas Enterprise. We specialize in cleaning service, home care, and